Morning, friends. Welcome to JW3, the home of Jewish culture and conversation. I'm Raymond Simonson. It's my pleasure and my privilege to be the CEO of this, the only Jewish community centre and cultural venue of its kind in the UK. A centre where, over the past decade, since we opened, we have continually sought to increase the quality, the variety, and the volume of Jewish conversation. Thank you all for coming along this morning at such short notice for what promises to be another very important conversation. As I'm sure all of my Jewish friends and colleagues here today know, last night we counted the 28th day of the Omer. This is a unique period in the Jewish calendar where we count each day, and we count each of the 7 weeks between the recent festival of Pesach and the forthcoming festival of Shavuot. We count and we count. So I've been thinking a lot about Jews and counting in recent weeks. For example, Jews Don't Count, David Baddiel's seminal book and documentary about why and how, in a time of intensely heightened awareness of minorities, Jews don't seem to count as a real minority to many. And I can't fail to mention Jews Do Count, the wonderful podcast series by JW3 and JPR, exploring key issues that impact on Jewish identity, partly based on the data that JPR counted. And as a community, of course, we've counted 227 days since the brutal Hamas terrorist attacks that saw the largest massacre of Jews since the Shoah, the Holocaust. And of course, we continue to count every single day since over 230 hostages were kidnapped. We never stop thinking about and praying for the over 130 hostages still unaccounted for 227 days on. And shockingly, though sadly not surprisingly to most of us in this room, CST have counted an almost 150% increase in reported incidents of anti-Semitism in the UK. So during this period of counting the Omer, I've been thinking about counting a lot, and also reflecting on who we, as a community, can count on. In particular, who we can count on outside of our community for support, for friendship, to stand alongside us and to stand up for us. In short, who is it that's prepared to stand up and be counted? So when the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities contacted us on Friday morning to say that the Secretary of State, Michael Gove, wanted to give a keynote speech to the community, we dropped everything to make sure we could host it and bring together key community leaders to be part of this conversation. The late former Chief Rabbi Lord Sachs taught us, leaders must establish a culture in which honest, open, respectful communication takes place, one that involves not just speaking, but also listening. Without it, tragedy is waiting in the wings. So it's in that spirit that I will ask all of you, regardless of your own personal political views or your current emotions over these very emotive issues, to please welcome Secretary of State Michael Gove into our home the way you would welcome any guest into your home. Let's listen before we have a chance to speak, and let's then engage in respectful conversation. Friends, please welcome Secretary of State for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, Michael Gove.
Thank you so much. It's a real privilege to be able to speak here at JW3. I'm really grateful to you for extending me this platform, and I'm also grateful to so many of you for coming at such short notice. Since the Hamas attack on Israel on October the 7th of last year, we've seen a shadow spread across the world and here in the UK. October the 7th was the largest pogrom perpetrated against the Jews since the Holocaust. The perpetrators of those killings have said that if they could, they would kill many, many more. And yet, within hours of news of the massacre being broadcast worldwide, and long before Israel had launched its current military operation inside Gaza, there was growing evidence of a remarkable phenomenon. Not sympathy and solidarity with the Jewish people as they faced another enemy bent on their extermination. No, quite the opposite. A questioning of the facts, a blaming of the victims, a campaign of hate directed not just against the Jewish state, but Jewish people everywhere. Let me quote from a speech given by my friend David Wolfson in the House of Lords last October, just a few weeks after the October 7th attack. David began his speech with this comparison. On Saturday night, I had 2 children in uniform. My son was in the uniform of the Israel Defense Forces. Like many 20-year-olds in Israel, he's doing military service, because if he didn't, there wouldn't be an Israel. He witnessed the aftermath of Hamas's atrocities firsthand. My other child in uniform was my daughter. Her uniform was trainers, jeans, and a Star of David necklace around her neck. That is her traditional Saturday night uniform, as with many teens who come in on the tube to enjoy this great city's nightlife. I was more concerned about my daughter. How on earth have we gotten to that place? How on earth? That was 6 months ago, when a father feared that his daughter was under threat in London if she was, to coin a phrase, openly Jewish. Since then, the shadow has only spread, the hate grown. We've seen an explosion in anti-Semitism. The charity charged with recording anti-Semitic incidents, the Communities Security Trust, recorded 4,103 incidents in 2023. As we've heard, that was an increase of 147% on the previous year, which was itself a record high. Of those figures, 2,699 incidents occurred after October the 7th. That is, more anti-Semitic incidents occurred between October the 7th and December the 31st, 2023, than in any previous 12-month period. And every day brings fresh examples. The chaplain driven off campus at Leeds University because he was Jewish. The visitor to a mosque promoting interfaith dialogue told he was not welcome because he was Jewish. The family who found their baby's passport defaced because they were Jewish. The stand-up comic who was told by a BBC comedy star that she would be killed and her family would be grieving for her in the cemetery because she was Jewish. The renovator of a dilapidated building threatened with a machete and told he should leave the, quotes, Jew building he was working in because he was Jewish. The reporter told not to cover an event because her eyes looked Jewish. And inseparable from these incidents are the increasingly strident, visible, and lurid demonstrations of anti-Semitism on our streets during protest marches. Swastikas, Hamas banners, depictions of Jews as exploiters, devils, child killers. It's incessant. We saw it again only this weekend. The imagery of Der Stürmer paraded past the gates of Downing Street. Now, of course, I know that many of those on these marches are compassionate people, driven by a desire for peace and an end to suffering. But they're side by side with those who are promoting hate. The organizers of these marches could do everything in their power to stop that. But many, the majority, don't. And we know now that it is genuinely dangerous for people to be openly, clearly, proudly Jewish near these marches. At a time when we're all encouraged to be our whole authentic selves, to celebrate our identity, to be out and proud, there is only one group told that they, and they alone, can only be tolerated on terms set by others, Jews. The organizers of the marches say that there are Jewish people on their demonstrations, but they are only safe if they deny what is dear to so many Jewish people, the safety of people in Israel. If they are to be accepted on these marches, then they must knuckle under, accept the calls to globalize the Intifada or to end the Zionist entity. They have to obey the rules laid down by others, those march organizers, who reserve the right to tell Jews both where they should live in the world and how they should live on our streets. It is a classic anti-Semitic trope to set the terms on which Jews will be accepted. Safe, provided they live in their ghetto. Safe, provided they don't get above themselves. Safe, provided they don't contemplate the use of force in self-defense. Until, of course, they aren't safe anymore. History tells us that the dismantling of the right of Jews to live like others on their own terms, leads inevitably to the destruction of Jewish lives. And that is why we must take a stand. We've seen where the unchecked growth of anti-Semitism has led in the past. We all know that what starts with the Jews never ends with the Jews. It's an ironclad law of history that countries which are descending into darkness are those which are becoming progressively more unsafe for Jewish individuals and the Jewish community. The Spain of the Inquisition, the Vienna of the 1900s, Germany in the 30s, Russia in the last decade. And it is a parallel law that those countries in which the Jewish community has felt most safe at any time are the countries where freedom and progress are most secure at any time. The Netherlands of the 17th century, Britain in the first decades of the last century, America in the second half of that century. So when Jewish people are under threat, all our freedoms are threatened. The safety of the Jewish community is the canary in the mine. Growing anti-Semitism is a fever which weakens the whole body politic. It is a mark of a society turning to darkness and in on itself. And I see that directly in my work tackling extremism and promoting community cohesion. There is one thing which increasingly unites the organizations and individuals which give cause for extremist concern: anti-Semitism. It is the common currency of hate. It is at the dark heart of their worldview, whether Islamist, far right, or hard left. In the past, we've tended to bracket Islamists, the far right, and the extreme left as different causes for concern. And indeed, it is vitally important in dealing with extremism to be precise in the use of data and definitions. But increasingly we find that those undermining our democracy and society from different points on the extremist compass are all drawn magnetically to converge on anti-Semitic tropes, language, ideas, and agitation. So far-right figures like Nick Griffin, formerly of the BNP, Mark Collett of an organization called Patriotic Alternative, Jada Franson of Britain First, and Jim Dawson, a transatlantic hate preacher, have been invited to share space with Islamist advocates and broadcast from Islamist platforms, where the common focus of concern is Jewish influence, the Jewish state, the Jewish threat. And on the extreme left, academics such as Professor David Miller and groups such as the Socialist Workers' Party, the Socialist Party, and the Revolutionary Communist Party jostle to share platforms with Islamist groupings, deploying aggressive language about Zionists, supporting calls for intifada, and praising the resistance, a synonym for Hamas, in terms that Jewish students say cause them physical fear. And extreme Islamist groups themselves then weaponize this growing anti-Semitism to divide Muslim from Muslim. Islamists have demanded that mosques become no-go zones for Zionists, that interfaith dialogue exclude any Jewish voice sympathetic to Israel's existence, and that believers show that they are truly faithful by demonstrating their commitment in the fight against Israel. By making ardor against Israel and hostility to Jewish voices the litmus test of how good a Muslim you are, Islamists polarize and divide our Muslim communities. That is why none of us can afford to be indifferent to the increasing prevalence of anti-Semitism in our society. There's a reason television series about the 1930s are called A Lesson from History. A growth in anti-Semitism is both a precursor of greater hate and an enabler of further extremism. Anti-Semitic tropes, which encourage people to think that criticism of Israel is muted or censored by Jewish control of the media, feed into greater distrust of the MSM. That leads to a greater willingness to believe in conspiracy theories and a stronger propensity to seek out alternative truth-tellers, whether on incel message boards, anti-vax YouTube channels, far-right Telegram groups, or Islamist podcasts. And thus, the common ground on which our democracy depends is eroded. And the continual insinuation, sometimes the open assertion, that the major political parties are in hock to Jewish finance is also an effort to divide and demonize. Extremists will argue that Jewish money drives both foreign policy and domestic decision-making in countries like our own, in order deliberately to fuel disaffection with democracy and to encourage a further flight to the extremes. So understanding and countering the rise in anti-Semitism all around us is central to the wider struggle against extremism, division, and hate, and the defense of democracy, freedom, and civilization. And this new development in the nature of extremist activity is also related to the changing nature over time of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, as the late Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sacks pointed out, is a virus that evolves. In medieval times, it was a religious prejudice, requiring conversion on the part of Jewish individuals to eliminate the Jewish faith. In the late 19th and early 20th century, the focus changed. The perverted notions of racial science and ethnic purity led the Nazis and their collaborators to wish to end Jewish lives in order to eliminate the Jewish people. And anti-Semitism now is increasingly focused on the Jewish home, on Israel. Self-styled progressive opinion, against borders, skeptical of the nation state, determined to link prosperity to exploitation, anxious to make every conflict one centered on privilege, has been mobilized and charged. So now the focus is on the delegitimization and demonization of the state of Israel as a prelude to its dismantlement and destruction. That is what the cry of "from the river to the sea" envisages: the erasure of the Jewish people's home. Bethlehem, Nazareth, and Jerusalem to become unified. These protests may ostensibly be presented as against Israel's actions in Gaza, but in reality, they're directed against Israel's continued existence. Israel is denounced as an apartheid state conducting a genocide. The worst evils of the last 100 years, apartheid, genocide, are situated in one country, the Zionist construct, the Jewish home. The calls for boycotts, divestment, and sanctions from protesters on these marches are endorsements of a campaign, the BDS campaign, which I can see is explicitly anti-Semitic. The Britain-Israel Communications and Research Centre has submitted evidence to Parliament making clear that the founder and ideologue of the BDS movement has repeatedly made clear his non-recognition of the rights of Israel to exist, and the BDS campaign oppose a Jewish state in any part of Palestine. The end point is clear: the elimination of Israel as we know it. Being clear about what the BDS campaign wants is very far from giving the Israeli government, any Israeli government, a free pass. It is, of course, legitimate, sometimes very necessary, to criticize the conduct of Israel's government. That is why this government have continually, since October the 7th, stressed the need for aid to flow freely to civilians in Gaza. We've worked for diplomatic progress towards peace. We've emphasized that there will have to be ultimately a two-state solution, and we've argued that military action must always be governed by international humanitarian law. But while it's necessary to be clear about where we may differ from the Israeli government at any point, just as we differ from other friends from time to time, it is even more necessary to be clear about what is going on here more broadly. We have to draw attention to the way in which Israel, unique among nations, is so consistently treated differently from others, to consider why, and to see what the impact of that is on the Jewish community here in Britain. There are no BDS campaigns directed against Bashar Assad's Syria, the regime guilty of killing more Muslims in living memory than any other. There are no student encampments urging university administrators to cut all ties with China, given what is happening in Xinjiang or Hong Kong, or what happened in Tibet. I know of no efforts to organize marches in their thousands to demand immediate action to stop the persecution of the Rohingya or Karen people by Myanmar's government. I may have missed it, but agitation to end the war in Sudan, or in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or Mali, or Ethiopia, does not seem to energize our campuses. And nowhere is there any suggestion, other than with Israel, that the errors or even crimes of a country's leaders should necessitate the end of that country's independent existence. No one argues that the state of Syria is illegitimate, or Myanmar should be dismantled or deconstructed. That is why the argument that the cry of "from the river to the sea," or calls for the globalization of the Intifada, or demands for victory for the resistance are not really anti-Semitic, are so disingenuous. They are cries targeted against the reality of collective Jewish experience. They're denials of the reality of collective Jewish suffering. The calls for the end of collective Jewish existence. And we should all remember what those who have endured anti-Semitism at its worst have asked for when they were at last free: a safe home. When the British Army liberated Bergen-Belsen in 1945, the survivors in that camp marked the end of their persecution with a song of salvation. It was the Hatikva, the song that has become Israel's national anthem. As long as the Jewish spirit is yearning deep in the heart, with eyes turned towards the east, looking towards Zion, then our hope, the 2,000-year-old hope, will not be lost. To be a free people in our land, the land of Zion and Jerusalem. Those voices could not be crushed 80 years ago, but there are a growing number who want to silence that song today. And nowhere is that campaign more visible today than on our campuses. The encampments which have sprung up in recent weeks across universities have been alive with anti-Israel rhetoric and agitation. But more than that, they have been deeply, profoundly intimidatory to Jewish students and others. Yet they've not appeared in a vacuum. They followed years of ideological radicalization. The encampments, in their slogans, programs, and demands, reflect a prevailing intellectual fashion: decolonization. The radical left, the extreme left, rejects the idea that successful states, whether it's the United Kingdom, Israel, South Korea, the US, or any European nation, can have prospered because of free markets, Enlightenment values, liberal parliamentarianism, property rights, and so on. The hard left finds it impossible to acknowledge that higher material living standards, and indeed greater human flourishing in some states rather than others, is better explained by reference to Adam Smith, John Locke, Edmund Burke, and Karl Popper, rather than Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, Franz Fanon, and Edward Said. That historic fact is unconscionable for the dedicated activists of the radical hard left. So they argue that the prosperity of states such as the US, the UK, France, Spain, and even Australia or Canada must be built on exploitation and empire. That argument, as my colleague Kemi Badenoch has brilliantly shown, and historians from Neil Ferguson to Nigel Biggar have reinforced, is inherently flawed. But these ideas are deeply congenial to those authoritarian states who are increasingly arrayed together against us. For Iran, for China, and even for Russia, the decolonization narrative is meat and drink. The idea that the success of liberal Western nations is built on plunder and exploitation, that we seek even now to dominate others through illegitimate means, and that our attachment to freedom is mere hypocrisy, is central to their efforts to advance their goals. That is why forces within those powers seek to influence the debate in our country. They want to weaken our collective resolve in support of democratic values and fellow democracies. And they know that if they can undermine support for Israel by encouraging a broader lack of self-confidence in the West's values, they'll have secured a signal victory. It is no mere coincidence that Iran, Russia, and China are sources and spreaders of anti-Semitic and anti-Israel narratives. They know that those intellectual currents erode our shared defenses. And they know that if the decolonization narrative and the delegitimization which follows can prevail in the case of Israel, then it will be a profound breach in the West's collective defense. Because nowhere is the narrative more ahistorical and illogical than it when it comes to Israel. But they know that if they undermine Israel, the other dominoes will fall. Why is delegitimizing Israel so important? Because Israel is transparently successful because of its democratic values, not exploitation. Israel has next to no material resources. It's been surrounded by enemies since its recreation, and those enemies sought to strangle it at birth. It's a land of refugees and asylum seekers, built by those fleeing persecution, not enacting it. And Israel was itself a nation reborn after imperial subjugation under the Ottoman Empire, which endured for hundreds of years. So Israel in 1948 was a poor, shunned, embattled, and fragile child of empire. And yet Israel succeeds. Why? Because of its values. A belief in courage, enterprise, and endeavor. A belief in the worth of every individual soul. A robust democracy, a market economy, a commitment to liberty. But for a section of the extreme left to acknowledge that would be to admit that their ideology is wrong, that decolonization theory is refuted by facts on the ground, that the real route to prosperity and progress lies through free markets and free peoples in strong liberal nation states. So Israel's success must be delegitimized, its achievements denigrated, its example dismantled. It has to be branded as a settler state, a colonial construct, a racist endeavor. It has to be found guilty of the greatest sins of empire, apartheid and genocide. Now, if these arguments were restricted to the seminar room and the journal article, that might be one thing. But as history reminds us, ideas have consequences. Young minds can become entranced, and ideologies can lead to actions. Indeed, some of those advancing these ideas have subsequently celebrated the most terrible actions. There were actually voices in academia who described the pogrom of October the 7th as decolonization in action. Mavish Ahmed, assistant professor in human rights and politics at the LSE, responded to the Hamas massacre by saying that decolonization, quotes, is not a metaphor. And an associate professor at McMaster University in Canada, Emile J. Joseph, occupied the same intellectual terrain. Post-colonial, anti-colonial, and decolonial are not just words you heard in your EDI workshop, he tweeted. And the effect of that rhetoric, those views, that celebration of resistance, has been felt by Jewish students as hostile and intimidating on campuses here in the UK. In Leeds University earlier this month, graffiti proclaimed that the faculty were funding a, quotes, effing genocide. The graffiti went on, Israel is harvesting Palestinian organs. That is a direct invocation of one of the oldest and most vicious anti-Semitic tropes, the blood libel. On Bristol University, the encampment posters claim that our media and politicians are lying because they are, quotes, Zionist funded. Another anti-Semitic trope, the all-powerful Jewish conspiracy. At SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies, part of London University, there's a declaration of, quotes, full solidarity with the Palestinian resistance, i.e. Hamas, and a proclamation that the student union is, quotes, a historically anti-Zionist space with a duty to uphold BDS. Yet again, telling Jewish students they are not welcome unless they deny their own identity. Anti-Semitism repurposed for the Instagram age. And alongside these student demonstrations, academics on the far left who advance decolonization narratives, such as David Miller, outline a program that tells Jews and Britons what their terms of surrender should be. He calls for the end of, quote, Zionist organizations, a program of, quotes, individual de-Zionization, and, quotes, abolishing the fact of the Zionist entity or any hope that it could ever be resurrected, as well as a re-education program to deal with the toxic effects in our country of Zionist ideas. How can Jewish students experience this as anything other than the most direct hostility and hate? And how can we allow it to continue unchallenged? We cannot. That is why the government is taking action. That's why we're legislating to prevent universities from enabling anti-Semitism by endorsing the anti-Semitic BDS campaign. The legislation is making its way through the House of Lords and has been endorsed by politicians from all parties, as well as the Board of Deputies of British Jews and the Jewish Leadership Council. But its progress recently has been slowed by opposition peers. I have a simple request of opposition parties who I believe are absolutely sincere in their abhorrence of anti-Semitism. Listen to the Jewish community. Send a message to the anti-Semites on our campus. Back the bill now. There's much more that needs to be done. I believe universities, schools, government departments, the NHS, and local government, indeed all public bodies, should sign up to a new charter against anti-Semitism, adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, and make clear that anti-Semitic agitation will be met with clear disciplinary action. We also need to ensure that the marches on our streets, which have caused so much distress, indeed physical intimidation of Jewish people, are dealt with more effectively. That is not to criticize the police, who have to operate within a framework that we politicians set. It is we politicians who must do better, and we can. Today, the former Labour MP John Woodcock will publish a groundbreaking report into political violence and intimidation. Its analysis is brilliant, and its recommendations both compelling and far-reaching. Some will require detailed debate and thought, but that cannot be an excuse for delay in dealing with the challenges that he addresses. We must make rapid progress to deal with the intimidatory consequences of marches by looking at their cumulative effect. We have to consider more closely how to police repeated invocations of prejudice, and we also need to ensure that organizers pay for the consequences of their actions. There is also more we need to do to bolster the role of the government's independent advisor on anti-Semitism. And to take the matter with the seriousness it demands, I intend to establish a parallel independent advisor on anti-Muslim hatred. We must also call out extremist groups, ensure that they aren't given public platforms, endorsement or money, tighten the rules on charities, and look at how to ensure that extremists cannot continue to abuse our tax system. But alongside legislation in Parliament and executive action by government, there is a broader duty, one for all of us. We must not be silent. We must not let tolerance for different views become a moral relativism that refuses to defend the democratic principles and traditions we cherish in this country. We must say to every Jewish citizen in this country, your safety is the best guarantee of our security. Your freedom to live as you choose is the only way that we can be certain we remain a land of liberty. Your future is our future. We said never again, and that is a promise we will never, ever disavow. Thank you. Thank you again for coming, and of course if people would like to ask me questions or indeed put points, please feel free. And if anyone would like to, please put their hand up and identify yourself if you're speaking on behalf of a media organization or a community group or another institution. Yes.
Thank you very much. Kate McCann from Times Radio. I want to ask a question about bystanders. You mentioned a few times, particularly in relation to protests, that there are good people who go on marches who are not anti-Semitic, but who will march alongside people with anti-Semitic banners. And it's something we've been talking about this week in institutions like the NHS, good people watching bad things happen. Why do you think people are not speaking up, and what can the government do to ensure that we all take responsibility?
I think people on the marches, good people, Quakers, peace activists, feel intimidated when it comes to calling out some of the slogans, the placards, and the agitation that they see around them. Some of those people on the marches have a deep commitment, either a faith commitment or a moral commitment to peace. And I can understand why they feel that they do need to be on these marches and their voices should be heard. But I would encourage them, I would encourage all of us, when we see behavior that we think is inappropriate, to call it out. And you are right as well, that sometimes in government and in other institutions, people walk on by rather than being clear about what is unacceptable. And justice for all depends on each of us, when we see an injustice, calling it out. Yes.
Thank you, Max Kendix at the Times. Just wanted to ask on the International Criminal Court. You've been very clear that you think the ICC doesn't have jurisdiction in this case. Assuming the ICC disagrees and an arrest warrant is issued, will you be absolutely clear that if Netanyahu comes to the UK, he wouldn't face any sort of action?
Well, again, I stressed when I was on Times Radio earlier that I'm not a lawyer, so I can't litigate the position within the ICC. But one thing is clear to me, the ICC is wrong to project any sort of moral equivalence between Israel and Hamas. Of course it is the case that Israel and the Israeli government have and will make mistakes, and they need to be held accountable for those errors. But there is a difference between a state attempting to defend its own citizens against a terrorist attack and a terrorist organization that has made it clear that it will act with the utmost ruthlessness and absolutely no discrimination in its effort to eliminate the Jewish people in Israel. So there can be no equivalence between them, and that moral position, I think, has to guide our response to the legal operation of the ICC. Yes.
Hi, thanks. Secretary of State. Emilio from Politico here. Sorry, just to change the subject briefly. This morning I heard you talk about the vested interests in deep pockets working to water down leasehold reform in your Times Radio interview. Campaigners think one example of those vested interests is the Chancellor. He promised to keep out of the ground rent debate because of possible conflicts of interest, but is now arguing to protect high ground rents. Is the Chancellor one of those vested interests you talked about? And can you promise leaseholders they'll be protected via the proposed maximum £250 ground rent cap?
No, and yes. Yes, just there, sorry, yes.
Hi, Natasha Clark from LBC. You spoke about the Wolney report, which is meant to be out today. I think one of the recommendations from him is that extremist protest groups should be prescribed as extreme and some of them banned. You've not named any of those specific groups today. Would you like to name any of those which you feel are particularly inappropriate? And would you like to take action on that before the election?
Well, I think it's important that when John Woodcock, Lorne Wolney's report is published, that we look at it in full. And I don't want to preempt some of the detail that will be within it. There is a separate process that we're undertaking, parallel but separate, across government to identify organisations of extremist concern, to name them, and to explain what the consequences of that would be. That doesn't involve banning them. It involves making sure that they don't have access to government money, a government platform, or the legitimacy that comes with that. And that process is going on at the moment, and we will, in due course, name the first tranche of groups that qualify, and then go on beyond that. But I think it's important that John has an opportunity to present his report, because it's very wide-ranging. And as I say, I think the quality of the argument is brilliant, and the recommendations make sense. Yes.
Hi, Martin Beckford from the Daily Mail. At the recent local elections, we saw quite a few candidates elected on campaigns mainly about Gaza. Are you worried about what this might do for local government, and also will this continue into the general election, and what will happen if so? Thanks.
Yeah, I'm deeply worried. I think that some of the cries that were issued after the votes were counted were deeply provocative, and some of the campaign rhetoric was designed to divide in our society. Of course, people have strong feelings about the conflict in the Middle East, and I would never want to fetter or censor any individual expressing those strong feelings. But it is also the case, we have to be alive to the fact that there are Islamist organizations, extreme left figures, and far-right figures who want to undermine our democracy and will use electoral events as a means to do so. Yes, gentleman in the middle there. And then probably after you've asked your question, then if you wanted to, probably quicker just to pass the microphone to the two colleagues behind you. Yeah.
Secretary of State Michael Knowles from the Daily Express. What evidence have you seen of foreign states interfering in the marches? Have you seen any evidence of countries such as Iran directly interfering and perhaps even fueling the tensions that we've seen? Thank you.
We saw in the Quds Day march, which took place, evidence that organizations that were backed and supported by Iran were directly involved in that march. I can't see much more at the moment for understandable reasons, but yes.
Hi, Sophie Huskisson from the Daily Mirror. Since Hamas's attacks, we've also seen anti-Muslim hate rising in the UK. I just wondered if this is something you're also concerned about, and what plans you have to try and reduce that.
I'm deeply concerned about it, and as I tried to make clear in my speech, some of those who are most intent on dividing Muslims are the people who attempt to weaponize anti-Semitism. I'll be making an announcement about a new advisor on anti-Muslim hatred, and it is also the case that there are attempts by people on the far right who are anti-Semites to also foment hate between different communities in this country, and they too have our Muslim neighbors in their sights as well. My argument today was intended to ensure that all of us recognize that the extremists who cause us so much difficulty and who are sowing division are all united by one thing, anti-Semitism. And if we tackle that, then we can do the single most important thing, I think, in making sure that we understand the animating ideology behind these groups, and these are groups which are also threatening to our Muslim neighbours and to British Hindus, Sikhs, and others. Yes.
Thanks, Chris McKeon, PA. It sort of follows on from Kate's question on the subject of protest organisers not doing enough to deal with anti-Semitism. What would you like to see them do? Is it enough to simply call out anti-Semitic behaviour, or are there other kind of specific steps you want to see them take?
Well, again, ideally, the organisers of these marches should be clear about what is not acceptable. They should make it clear that there are slogans and symbols that undermine a legitimate expression of concern. But it's also the case that there are tools that government can use, and John Woodcock has said more about that, and those tools can include looking at the cumulative impact on particular communities of expressions of hate, and then also potentially getting the organisers to pay for the consequences of those marches. When Chelsea Football Club host a match at Stamford Bridge, they pay for the cost of policing. I wouldn't want to ensure that there was no opportunity for an organisation without means to protest, but if you protest again and again and again in significant numbers, and that has an impact on policing and on the security of others, then it's certainly worth considering whether or not the organisers of the march should be held liable for those costs and that disruption.
Hi.
Yeah, sorry, gentleman there, then there, then there, if that's okay.
Sorry,
sorry.
Just a quick
Yes.
question before I pass it on. Eleni Correa from The Guardian. I just want to ask, you mentioned a lot of people who go to the protests in London in favour of Palestine, who are there for peace, who are there because they're concerned about the humanitarian crisis. What's your advice to them about how they can make their feelings known without, contributing to the problem of anti-Semitism?
I think there are many ways in which people can make their feelings known, from writing and lobbying their MP to making their voices heard through media and other platforms. But all of us have a duty and a responsibility to consider the words we use, and then it's also sometimes the company that we keep. And again, my view is that when these marches started, there was a strong feeling from people who were deeply committed to peace. But as we've seen these marches progress, action has not been taken to deal with the individuals who are peddling hate on these marches, and that requires collective action. Government action in the last resort, but what I would hope would be the case is that those who are participating and organising these marches would reflect on what these marches have enabled and consider a far better way of making their point peacefully in a way that all of us can recognise is motivated from compassion without facilitating hate.
Henry Robinson, against violent extremism. Minister, for over 2 decades now, there's been a political warfare campaign in universities and cities led by a few individual groups in the UK. Some of the groups behind these protests today, 4 or 5 years ago, they had banners about genocide. This import of political warfare is leading to the educational ethnic cleansing of Jewish students from certain universities. And some of these organisations have clear links to Hamas. Furthermore, they have the protection of limited company status, but that the state offers them. Is this really acceptable, where these groups are proven to be promoting Jew hate?
I think it's very important for us in dealing with the phenomena that you describe to proceed with rigour, with energy, and also with care. Because we know that there are some organisations that are involved in spreading hate, that are capable of using our law and our institutions to shield themselves and to evade responsibility for their actions. So we do need to proceed with care, but you are absolutely right. There are organisations, some Islamists, some far left, some on the far right, that we do need to be more energetic in pursuing, yeah. And a gentleman there, I think, and then a gentleman in the third row.
Thank you. My name is Arieh. I'm from the Union of Jewish Students. Thank you for speaking to us today. I also want to take the opportunity to thank you for your participation in the roundtable at number 10 with Vice Chancellors, where we are still yet to see any serious action from those Vice Chancellors who made lots of very positive noises there. Last year, your government passed the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act. We're approaching it coming into law. And the guidance that the Office of Students is putting out as draft form leaves space for the legitimisation of Holocaust denial. It could lead to universities not being able to adopt the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. It could mean that anti-Semitism awareness training is unable to be delivered on universities to staff and volunteers, and that campus becomes an even less safe space for Jewish students. As a senior government minister, as Secretary of State, with someone who has serious influence and impact at the highest levels, will you commit to not enacting the Act if the OFS guidance doesn't see radical change?
I'm grateful to you for articulating a concern that a number of students have. I do believe that free speech is important, but I also believe that countering prejudice is important. I know my colleagues Luke Hall and Gillian Keegan want to proceed with care by making sure that we can continue to have universities as places where people can encounter different views, where their own views can be challenged, without it becoming the case that they become intimidatory spaces for anyone. Yes.
Harry Horton from ITV News. A question about Lord Walney's report, which we haven't seen yet.
Yeah.
But there has been a pattern in recent years of police being given more powers to crack down on protests. And in the last few minutes, in fact, we've just seen that the High Court has ruled that regulations lowering the threshold for police interventions in protests have been ruled unlawful. Are you worried that these moves by your government might mean in future that protests that you happen to agree with mean that protests are less likely to take place?
No. I think it's vitally important that we give the police the powers required to deal with something that is directly intimidatory. I think it is important that we see order restored, calm upheld, and the intimidation that our Jewish neighbours feel ended. So I know it's natural to worry about the misuse or breach of powers handed to the police, and there have been occasions in the past when individuals within the police force or those commanding police forces have misused those powers. But the balance now has to be with making people safer. And we can't have a situation where you have repeated examples of anti-Semitic hate and the intimidation of people on our streets. And if we need to refine and strengthen the powers available to the police in order to deal with that, that is the right thing to do. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Hannah Weissel from Yachad. I wanted to ask you about community cohesion, because I think it's under serious threat in this country and has been since October the 7th. And I'm interested to know how we ensure and how the government ensures that we don't pit legitimate concerns and fears about anti-Semitism against civil liberties and rights and freedoms, which will inevitably make anti-Semitism worse. And just to give you one example, which you referenced, the boycott legislation, which is going through Parliament at the moment, there is diversity of opinion, even within the Jewish community, about whether that is helpful in the fight against anti-Semitism. And I think that is just one example of where we can see a concern that anti-Semitism and freedom are being directly pit against each other in the fight to make this country safer.
Yes, the key thing, of course, is that in a healthy democracy, there'll be diversity within communities, and sometimes trade-offs. But one of the things I worry about is that people within the Jewish community and allies of the Jewish community sometimes feel, well, if we really speak out about the nature of anti-Semitism and we demand that something be done about it, then we'll only make it worse. I worry that that is appeasement, and that sometimes you do have to say, look, I'm really sorry about that, and it may be an honest mistake on your part, but you know, those comments, that metaphor, those tropes, are anti-Semitic. And I think at the moment, when we have the explosion of anti-Semitism that's been recorded, people, particularly outside the Jewish community, have a responsibility to say, where does this come from? Why is it manifest? And how can we counter it? And of course, that debate should be civil, but I also think it's important that people within the Jewish community and those who care about the fate of the Jewish community know that the government is alive and alert to these dangers and taking steps to deal with them. With that, I think I now have to go, and I really want to say thank you to everyone who came along here, and look forward to carrying on conversations with many people in this room about how we tackle this challenge and what the best way forward is. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Friends, thank you so much for your patience this morning. Thank you to the members of the press for coming to JW3, especially if it's your first time here. Just a couple of quick reminders. Actually, first of all, a really important thank you to colleagues